Lindsey Graham.
Georgetown is an interesting little town. We biked around it, and you know, if you go on the basis of yard signs, it's about 50-50. You know, I think he's being more positively received than anyone in that party has been received before running. But I don't know whether it'll carry him over. There's South Carolina's classified as an inelastic state, meaning it's in terms of being baked in, things are baked in here. So it's kind of hard to move. It's kind of hard to move things in this state. Not as many undecideds, unlike North Carolina, not quite as many transplants from other parts of the country quite yet. So still inelastic.
So we're now live on YouTube. So this is like the beginning of the class, right?
We should wait until 9:45 since that's the official start time.
Yeah, I just wanted to do a heads up that we're now live.
Yeah.
John told me to go live at 9:40, so
That's okay. Just
That's what you did.
I kind of wanted to jump the gun a little bit because I wasn't quite sure of my internet ability and everything that goes along with going live. So,
what's your name?
William Lee.
William Lee. It's nice to have you here.
Nice to see everybody, and I think I know a few of y'all. Met through the Wednesday night suppers when we actually had those. That was seems like a long time ago now.
You're the NASCAR fellow.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've seen you on Wednesday night.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Helps put all the pieces together.
Can't wait till we can get back to doing that. It's been way too long.
Yeah. Maybe next fall.
I hope so.
Before that.
Yeah, we don't have them in the summer. So.
Oh yeah.
Well, you think the participants would be pretty safe in their own cars, wouldn't you? Is it the fans that you need?
It's the pit crew.
Oh, yeah, they're doing well as far as keeping everything safe. They have some good protocols in place. So.
We were talking about Wednesday night live.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm jealous of Jane's coffee, so I may run and get some.
There are a bunch of people talking somewhere.
Someone's got a radio on.
Uh-huh.
Well, it
Hi,
sounds like a radio.
Oh, Charlie.
A lot of people there.
Evelyn, are those your flower pictures on the wall back there?
Who's got pictures of them?
I think Charlie was asking the Crawfords if they got pictures of flowers on the wall.
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
Only the ones that she painted.
The wildflowers are the smaller pieces I painted.
They're beautiful.
Pardon?
They're beautiful, he said. Thank you. It looks like we've got a good crowd, and to make sure that Steve has as much time as he needs or wants, we'll welcome him back for the third session of this discussion of equity in healthcare. And so, Steve, thank you so much. And I'll prompt. Last week, he suggested that we consider thoughts and ideas for a potpourri for next week's session. Unless he changes his mind on that, well, I'll put that started at the beginning instead of just at the end.
Well, thank you for that, Van, because I am going to look to getting suggestions at the tail end of today's session for what we ought to cover in the fourth session. It doesn't have to be one major topic. It could be a combination of things that y'all want to discuss or talk about. So yes, thank you for that. Do be thinking about that, because I'd like to adjust the fourth session to the audience. So let me know what your thoughts are. Let's see. Quick introduction for those who don't know me, who may be attending this session. This is the third of four and may not have heard who I am before. So I'm Steve, and I've lived in Davidson since 2000. My bona fides, I guess, Davidson alum, married to Phyllis, who's a nurse, and I'm a physician. I spent about 20 something years in emergency medicine in and around the Charlotte area, 12 years in East Africa doing global health work for a not-for-profit that was centered around health system strengthening. I do like to think about things in terms of systems, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. And especially when it comes to equity, because I don't think you can adequately discuss equity from a purely individual perspective, because it's about relative comparisons and distributing things fairly across between folks is what fairness is. So you almost by default have to think just on a systems basis to discuss it or to think about it. And given that we're 9 days away from a major historical election, to not be well, who's not aware of it, but to not acknowledge it in the discussions of systems and equity would be maybe ill-advised, or maybe even talking about it is ill-advised these days. I'm not quite sure what's ill-advised, but let me try to explain how it can be talked about. And partly, I think that people make the mistake to think that we must be apolitical. And if we're going to change systems and be equitable, then we have to be political. The problem comes in is when we apply that filter to our thoughts and our decision making. And if those of you needed for me to talk about this topic, you needed to know my political party before I was invited to be a speaker to you guys, then the filter has been applied too early in the process. And it's a mistake to apply it that like up front. So I think it's a mistake to apply a filter to a scientific advisor. So you may see in the news that Fauci's supposedly a Democrat. That's a mistake to apply a filter of politics so early, even before you discuss facts. So I think we can discuss facts. It's possible to discuss facts, numbers, etc., without necessarily discussing the party of the person providing the facts. It used to be possible. It's really hard these days to do it, but I think that's still possible. But it is also not possible to get through and discuss equity and distribution and systems without eventually applying some form of a political filter. It doesn't have to be a party, but there are policy decisions and other things that impact our health on a daily basis, and we all know that. So we can't avoid the topic. We just, in my view, we need to appropriately apply the filter at the time in our decision making when it needs to be applied, and not carry that all the way back up to the very beginning where the facts started and say, okay, we're going to ignore this person giving us the facts on the basis of whatever their partisan position is down the road. So that's my view on it. And if that's, I don't know, I don't necessarily want to stir up a hornet's nest with it, but I thought, it's just important to outline that, because we're going to get into some things that I consider to be facts, no matter what party I'm in. And then we're going to talk about a few things that I may have a particular slant on the basis of what I think is fair. And I think that should be debated with the same facts. is kind of what I'm getting at. So I don't know if I should pause there for intervention on the part of somebody to save me from what I'm about to do, but if anybody wants to throw me a life preserver, feel free. I'm gonna get down here to share screen if my little buttons start working. Okay. Okay, people see the first slide? Yeah. See the first slide says global health equity.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
So this is the same first slide we've started with every single Sunday, just because I found a Bible verse that had the word equity in it, so I could claim that it was a scriptural concept. So that's still the case. Hadn't changed. Same facts. And then I wanted to show this slide. And I was in London school back in 2008 doing tropical medicine intensive course to prepare to go to Africa, given that I was going to see things that I'd only read about in medical school and I needed a refresher. And I know some of you know what rheumatic heart disease is. And it's a disease that would have been prevalent in the childhood of a lot of folks that are on this call, but has virtually disappeared in the United States. There's still pockets in Native American populations and still pockets occasionally in some clusters in the United States. But for the most part, it's disappeared. But it's the #1 acquired heart disease in poor countries around the world. And it is a killer of people in their early 20s. And they have preventable death at an early age from this problem. Now, what's interesting about the graph you're looking at that I copied off the internet, obviously, is over the time period in the United States, what the incidence, actually it's the death rate from rheumatic fever or rheumatic heart disease in the United States over these decades. What I find particularly interesting is because rheumatic fever is caused by strep throats that happen over and over and over again. So the bacteria group A strep people get infected with in a standard sore throat or strep throat, and then that resolves on its own, and then they get it again, and then they get it again, and eventually they develop an immune response to it that starts attacking their joints. And then it starts attacking their heart valves and they get heart damage. And then they end up with what's called rheumatic heart disease. And then the valves are so badly damaged, the heart fails, and that's the cause of death. And so back in the day before penicillin, and you look at when penicillin became available, the death rate for rheumatic fever in the United States was plummeting before there was even an antibiotic to prevent or to treat strep throats and repeated infections of strep throat. And what that's important to understand and is fascinating to me is to see the degree of drop and plummet that there was there, and to understand that I couldn't attribute it to medical advances and therapeutics like penicillin that treat an infectious disease, that there were other things going on that resulted in this dramatic drop of rheumatic fever, an infectious disease, before there was the antibiotic to treat it. So in those determinants of health we've talked about for a couple of weeks, obviously something other than medical care was contributing both to the prevalence of it and to the it being diminished as in prevalence over the course of decades in the United States. It's still a bit of a mystery what that was. There's a few isolated stories of Navy sailors that they spread the bunks just a little bit farther apart, and on those Navy ships, strep throats and rheumatic fever incidence and prevalence declined just by putting the bunks farther apart. And that's applicable to what we're facing out there in a global pandemic today, because in the absence of therapeutics that are the magic bullet, we have to deal with solutions such as social distancing in order to deal with a current infectious disease pandemic in this country And what we're talking about today is COVID from the perspective of health equity. And this story of rheumatic fever, I think, is applicable, is that we look to this down here and we look to the magic bullet, thinking like Westerners in a modern healthcare system to be the deal, when it's possible to have dramatic drops in the problem from other public health tools that can be used to deal with it. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. But this graph I saw when I was in London school, and it just struck me that it was a historically pertinent to what we're facing today and what we're discussing in this class. And these were, again, as a reminder, the 5 determinants of health. And clearly something was going on, most likely in the social factor category, that contributed to that drop in rheumatic heart disease in the United States. Clearly something's going on there that's contributing to it being still prevalent in pockets of poverty around the globe. And part of the reason it's of interest to me is because we did have a rheumatic heart disease program in the Touch Foundation where I worked in East Africa, and there were still young people presenting at the later stages of the disease who had had undetected problems because of a weak health system all throughout their life, and presented in heart failure too late to really do anything about it in their late teens and early 20s, which is really sad.
Hey, Steve?
Yeah.
Was any thought given to indoor plumbing or toilets?
This, there are people that did bring up hygienic sorts of considerations when it came to strep throat, and primarily for some of the same reasons that we have been concerned about, say, Amazon Prime deliveries and grocery stores, the thing called fomites, where something infectious can be on an object, and then without good hand washing, you transfer it from the object to your body. And so, in terms of indoor plumbing, having clean hands would be something that would potentially be something that would contribute to reducing the prevalence of an infectious disease that has fomites in the middle of it. So yeah, not so much the flush toilets and that sort of thing, because it's not a gastrointestinal disease, but clean hands, I think, is a factor, Van. Okay. This is a lot of words on the slide, and I wanted to talk about poverty as a risk factor for poor health in and of itself, partly for reasons that I discovered when I was in Tanzania, and as I was just alluding to, that a disease that's all but disappeared in the United States is still prevalent enough to be killing young people in a country like Tanzania. What is the deal with poverty that makes diseases be classified as a potentially a disease of poverty? And as we get into it later, when it comes to COVID, there are a number of a myriad of diseases that disproportionately impact people that are poor. And they're trying to do a better job of understanding what that is. But like I think Rosemary pointed out, those 5 determinants of health are interrelated with each other. They're not mutually exclusive buckets. One factor affects another factor, which affects another factor, which makes it a complex system. And people in poverty have any number of those determinants of health, all in an interplay that's contributing to why they may be having bad outcomes. And they're trying, I think, to understand that better with research. But just, the idea that you could have rheumatic fever still not understood, there is just theory and hypothesis for why that graph in rheumatic fever looked like it looked. I mean, to have really good scientific research about something this complex when you're not just studying a magic bullet like penicillin, is quite difficult to do actually. But some of the researchers out there are attempting it. And I did get introduced to a professor at UNCC who's an author on this article that's quoted here on this slide. His name's Mark DeHaven. And in the University City area, they have something called the University City Family Zone, which is a massive social determinants of health project right in our own backyard that I think we could learn a lot from. And I was really excited to get introduced to Dr. DeHaven, and I hope I'm able to learn a little bit more from him as we go along and apply some of that to even closer in our backyard to where we live now here in Davidson and North Mecklenburg. The fact that there are poor people who die more at a disproportionate rate from these cardiovascular conditions, from strokes and heart attack, and is significant. But the indication is that poverty is playing a major role here in an underlying explanation for why there's disproportionate impact in health on poorer populations. And this one I thought was interesting, and I debated about whether to include this here because the tendency of a doctor like myself is to look for some biologic explanation. The danger is to present some pseudoscientific explanation that sounds really like hard science and is not hard science. And intuitively, it made sense to me that this was the case, what you see here on this slide. And I am going to bring it up, even though I don't really have the kind of hard science knowledge around this to speak to it with a scientific lens. What makes sense to me is that poor folk wake up in the morning with stress and go to sleep at night with stress. That has to do just with being in a condition of poverty, and that this does have physiologic impact upon the body in terms of what you see here, inflammation and weakened immune function. It makes sense to me as a physician, even in the absence of just really, really hard science that sort of has measured the cortisol levels every morning in poor folk, and that kind of way of approaching this. I'm encouraged by the fact that scientific research is headed in this direction and trying to make these connections in a little more solid a way. But it also makes sense to me that if someone has already got a weakened immune system from their condition of poverty, that when they're faced with an infection, whether it's a strep throat or a COVID virus, they're more likely to have adverse outcomes because their body's weakened to begin with. And that's kind of the way I think I'm thinking about this a little bit, because some of the explanation for the numbers you're going to see a little later around why Latinx populations or African Americans are disproportionately affected by COVID has reasonably something to do with frontline worker positions and that kind of thing, and exposure, living conditions at home. I think more than likely what you see on this slide is also a contributing factor in terms of the underlying constant stress that people of color and people in poverty experience. And now I'm going to give you a warning that what I'm about to talk about has a little bit of politics associated with it. All right. And I'm in a unity and community small group of folks with that got formed after Charlottesville and a town prayer vigil on the town green here in Davidson. And we've been in small groups since 2017, getting to know people of color, because it's kind of hard to do that naturally in our communities. And so it was intentional small groups, and a number of you on this class are probably in that organization as well, so you know about it. And so we have folks in the group, and I was telling them about something that happened to me the other day. Phil and I were coming home, and on our mailbox was a white piece of paper that was stuck behind the flag, not the flag on the mailbox that you lift up for letting mail in. So I pull out these pieces of paper, it's like staple together 3 pieces of paper, start reading about baby killers and Democrats being socialists and, you know, that sort of language. And then, you know, a lot of you know where I live. I live at the corner of Lorimer and Chairman Blake, and I have political signs in my yard. So I'm assuming I wasn't randomly targeted for mimeographed sheets on my mailbox, but there they were. And I presume on the basis of the signs that are in my yard in that prominent intersection. And I was describing that to my friends in the group about how it made me feel, because it created a sense of unease for me. I was uncomfortable, essentially being a little bit marked and being a target for somebody's messaging that was, I would say, hateful. And and then when I shared that, the retired police person, who's an African American woman from New York City, who's retired down here to Cornelius, she said to me, you know, that's the way I feel every day, Steve. When I walk out of my house, the way that you felt after getting that message was the way I feel when I walk out of my door, and it's the way I feel when my kids leave the house, and it's the way I feel when they haven't come home yet from the party they went to, and it's the way I feel when they went off to college, and it's the way I feel every day. And it's hard not, that's hard. And so I think there's truth here to this idea that unease that people experience every day manifests in some of the disproportionate impacts we see, not only from diabetes and high blood pressure, but even from infectious diseases like a COVID virus or a strep throat. So in this study that was just released a couple of days ago by the CDC, and this gets up to where I take off again, I hope, the political filter that I just applied to myself in that story. I try to take it off, and I just try to present facts, you know, in terms of what are the scientists who were doing studies between January and October of this year, what are they documenting, how are they documenting, and what are their findings? And the numbers to be able to tell a story of inequity, numbers can be used to tell stories. I think some numbers better than others, and I'm going to explain why I think these numbers are good numbers to use, because all of us are getting inundated with numbers every day, and understanding the numbers, and and there are those on the call that can help me understand numbers even better, again, here in terms of what these numbers tell us. But I think they tell us some things about inequity. And the study looked at a projection of excess deaths. So they looked at past years before COVID, and they said, if all things remained the same, how many deaths would occur in 2020, in this case 9 months of it, if things stayed true to the past. And then they did it by age group in our country, and they did it by ethnicity in our country, and they sort of had a number that they said these were the deaths that we would expect. Now, how many deaths have we actually had from our health statistics? And they included, and they called them excess deaths because they included numbers that were not just COVID deaths, all deaths. And that's good, I think, because of the concern that things that people are dying from are being misclassified. Maybe it could have been COVID when it was diagnosed as pneumonia, or it wasn't COVID and it was something else. So to sort of take out the diagnostic uncertainties and to just say, we're just going to count all the deaths. How many more did we have this year than we would have projected that we should have had? And what do we think about that? Allocated and stratified along age and ethnic categories. And so that's what they did. And I like this approach, and I'll try to explain clearly this impact here on the following slide. So, you know, you've heard the numbers of 220 or somewhere around it there from COVID, and this was in early October. So they said that by their calculations, there were about 300,000 excess deaths in that period of time from January to the 1st of October, and about 2/3 of them they could attribute to COVID, and the remaining third to other causes. So those are the numbers that they just counted people who died in the United States and compared it to what they expected and labeled it excess deaths. And this is where it gets a little tricky. And this is where I could misstep because I'm not as adept with numbers and explanations as perhaps some others on the call are. And again, step in to help me, Dennis, or anyone else if I misspeak. But understanding the difference between something that's kind of a percentage or a proportion, something that's a relative comparison versus something that's just an absolute difference, that generates confusion in people. And you saw it when one of these health, I don't remember whether it was FDA or one of them was talking about the COVID treatment and its 30% improvement. But he was talking about a relative risk when the absolute risk was a better way of describing things. And what that was trying to distinguish, and I know I'm not being clear yet, is that when something improves from, say, 1% death rate to 2% death rate, on a relative basis, that's a big improvement, but it's still only on an absolute basis, just 1% improvement. So to tell people what really makes a difference, you need to be clear that you're talking about things that are absolute sometimes when you're talking about the impact that something happens of something. So to improve from a 1% death rate to 2 has significance on a percentage basis, relatively speaking, but it's still only a 1% overall absolute difference. So that was how that guy messed up trying to explain science back in the day about the antibody treatment for COVID. And I'm going to try to avoid, and so far I don't think I'm succeeding, but I'm going to try to avoid confusion in these numbers because I think it's important to sort of come away with a bit of an understanding of what these numbers tell us. And what these numbers, the way they did this was to say, you know, within a certain age group, you know, we're going to expect a certain percentage of people to die in 2020 from January to October. But within certain age groups, a much larger percentage of people died than expected. And so in this study, what makes this stand out is that this age group of more people, of a higher percentage of people dying than expected was in the 25 to 44-year-old age group. And where this is going to generate confusion is the clear-cut understanding that the highest risk age group is the oldest people, not this age group. And so how is this the finding of this study? And the reason that this is this way is because more people die when they're older than die when they're 25 to 44. And so if there's still more people dying of COVID that are older than people that are 25 to 44, but more people were expected to die anyway that were that age. So as a function of a percentage, the excess deaths in that higher age group aren't as big of a number percentage wise as they are for this age group of people that weren't expected to die in big numbers. So that's why the impact of COVID, by looking at it this way, is in this particular age group of folks. And it's a little counterintuitive and a little confusing, and maybe somebody can jump in there and help me a little bit, but it's also applicable to the ethnic divide we're going to get to on the next slide, which I think is another important thing to understand. And maybe when we get to the ethnicity explanations, you'll see it more clearly. But this second bullet was just the percentage of excess deaths in the age groups outlined by their age category. But in race and ethnicity, when you were using this sort of percentage increase as a marker, it's the Hispanic people in our communities that are bearing the brunt of the impact. And I know you've probably seen numbers that more African Americans have died of this than white folk and then Hispanic folk. But remember, we're talking about populations where you were projecting the deaths you expected to happen. And the African American population is older than the Hispanic population. And so, yes, you would expect more older people to die as an absolute number, but the percentage of excess deaths has really been experienced by the Latinx people in our communities, on the basis of the fact that they tend to skew younger, and you wouldn't have expected as many Hispanics to die in 2020 as have died. And so as a result, the percentage effect upon that population is higher. And I think that's I think that's interesting when we get and we think about the Latinx communities and why that's so. We think about the degrees of poverty in certain communities. I would suspect they would stratify as poorer. I suspect that their living conditions would be more crowded. I would suspect that they were on the front line in unprotected work environments. So to just look at total deaths and not the percentage underappreciates the impact upon the Latinx community that COVID has had. And so that's the point I'm trying to make here. And maybe Dennis, can you help me? Did I do an adequate job, or is there clarity or confusion around this? I don't know if Dennis hears me calling upon him to bail me out of this, but.
Yeah, it was fine, Steve. I don't see any problem with what you said.
Okay. Anybody need further clarification on why I mean, you'll see the numbers and you'll see graphs of total deaths, and then you'll see, and what they do is they take the numbers and they say how many people have divided by COVID, how many are black, how many are white, and then they say a certain percentage of the people who died from COVID are black. That percentage is higher than their percentage in the population, and so there's a disproportionate impact upon the blacks in our communities. And all that is true on the basis of what the numbers show. But when you dive into them a little bit more and you look at it from this excess deaths perspective, and as a percentage of the expected deaths, the Hispanic communities has been impacted in a way that is significantly greater than other populations when you look at these numbers across the board. All ethnic groups have had excessive deaths. The whites have had the least percentage, and but Hispanics significantly greater. And that was my attempt to bring a bit of a health equity perspective to COVID. I wanted to talk a little bit about the management of COVID, and everyone's heard about what the public health measures are intended to do, and heard the term flattening the curve, and this is a graph of what it is. And what the intent of this is, from a public health management perspective, is to have the caseload at any one time in our community be able to be carried as a burden by the system that can carry it, number of hospital beds, number of ventilators. And so if it spikes up there in really high numbers, it overwhelms the system. So one way to have more people survive is to make sure that they can be cared for in the existing system. Now, there are other management things you can do. You can increase the health system capacity, which you've seen people talk about, more ventilators, opening up field hospitals. That's meant to take that dotted line you see on this graph and raise it up so that you can handle more cases and have fewer deaths from not being overloaded. what we have to realize is another equity question is that this dotted line varies from state to state. It varies from country to country. It varies from town to town. It varies rurally. It varies urbanly. That is not one fixed line for everywhere around the world or even our country. And what is inequitable is to take a global pandemic and leave everybody in it for themselves, whether you're a rural village, whether you're a country, no matter what you are. In my view, it's inequitable and a management mistake to not acknowledge the fact that something global needs to have a global management strategy, not even simply a national one. But I think our world is failing to approach this from a global perspective. Part of that is because of increased nationalism right now around the globe, our country leading the way. There are historical examples of how global approaches have eradicated global infectious diseases. Smallpox, one of the major players just recently died. He was on the morning show I was watching this morning. His life well lived, played a major role in eradicating smallpox around the world. It took longer than it needed to because at one point the United States wasn't participating in the overall global vaccination effort. And when they finally stepped up and did it, and other countries did the same, smallpox was eradicated. This kind of threat, like coronavirus, requires the same kind of unified global perspective. And if you're withdrawing from the WHO and you're throwing out America first, political filter again, then you're not managing this with the kind of management approach that you need to have. We can't go it alone, because it doesn't matter in a global problem where we draw our dotted line for our health capacity. It matters what the global health capacity is in order to get something like this under control. At the very least, we could at least have a national response and a national strategy instead of leaving it to the governors to manage it on their own. So that is a criticism, and I think that it's well-founded, not only politically, but also scientifically, to say that it's a mistake to decentralize the management of a pandemic. Let's see. This is just a repeat with some different labels to what you saw in the previous slide. Now, I wanted to bring this up because it's something that you've seen on the news, and it's got some degree of a political component to it. And I sort of intentionally injected that a little bit. The herd immunity strategy for managing COVID was generated by this thing called the Great Barrington Declaration, and that came out of a libertarian think tank. I don't think that's necessarily surprising. I think there's some filters being applied here earlier than I think that they perhaps need to. And so the Lancet had a big multi-scientific, multi-country response to the proposal that we should be thinking in terms of herd immunity management techniques. And you can look up the John Snow memorandum and see it in the Lancet and see the reasoning why they said, big mistake, do not head into herd immunity strategies for managing the COVID pandemic. And the lack of nuance in terms of being able to do more than one thing at a time in these discussions is remarkable. In order to manage something as complicated as this, with economic implications as well as health implications, is that you need to have some degree of nuance and customization and nimbleness to what it is that you do. Some dynamic, moment by moment, month by month ability to change your course because we don't know everything and we still don't know it. And we particularly don't know about the immunity factors related to this virus for us to propose a herd immunity strategy. We still don't know enough. We don't know how long immunity lasts. We don't know how immune people are, how many people get reinfected. There have been anecdotes of some that do. We don't know how effective the vaccine is going to be. We don't know if we can truly achieve herd immunity. So to propose something you don't know that's going to work and have a lot of people die by it is just completely irresponsible. And I mean, there's no other way to put it. And we don't have to have this binary choice between full lockdown and full and wide open. There are ways to manage it with both eyes open, your economic eye and your health eye. And part of it is that in order to not have a patch over your health eye, you need to be able to test everybody and trace people and manage things from a public health perspective. So in the absence of the magic bullet like penicillin, a vaccine, or a therapeutic that quote unquote cures this virus, you need to know what it is that you're managing. So the testing and tracing is a standard, long-standing, effective way to use your wide open scientific eye to manage the infection, and would have to be a strategy involved in doing this, not shutting down testing. I mean, we have to know what it is that we're dealing with. We have to know our false positive rates, our false negative rates. There's just a lot that we could have done and that we know how to do and that we have public health expertise to do. And it's been a massive failure. And I really don't want to see this go on and percolate in our community the way that it does, continuing to fail to address it from a public health science perspective. And who's going to bear the brunt of that? It's not those of us who can safely sort of quarantine in places, unworried about where our next paycheck is going to come from. The people that suffer disproportionately from this are the marginalized and the poor, and they're bearing the brunt of our, let's open up everything and let's not manage this with science. And that is inequitable. And essentially this is saying what I just said, I think, in more scientific sort of perhaps less impassioned language. And this is the numbers of what we're dealing with that I could pull from the latest CDC website in terms of our total case numbers, the fact that we're on the upswing again in terms of case numbers, and deaths will also inevitably follow and along the same curves. So we're not out of the woods. We're not turning the corner. We're heading into flu season. We're in tough times, and we need good scientific, equitable solutions to deal with this crisis.
Steve, I'd just like to say that I've seen a lot of, in my professional literature, a lot of institutions and research organizations referred to, but I've never heard of the American Institute for Economic Research that gave that herd immunity statement there.
Yeah. It's just an example, in my view, of putting your filter in too soon. I think that it's appropriate to weigh in with some of that point of view when we're in a policy debate, maybe at some stage down the line, and everybody's obvious about what their filters are. But it's just dangerous to apply them early, and partly it's because the science gets politicized. In this case, our science has to be politicized for us to have a systemic response to it, is it eventually has to be translated into something that's public policy. There's no way to do a system solution without politics, but we can't apply it at such an early stage that then we're going to head away from what's factual into we're coloring and tainting our facts with our politics these days, and it's dangerous.
Steve, I have a question.
Okay.
What's the scientific percentage on herd immunity? I mean, I've heard it as low as 20%, which was disparaged, but then someone said 80%. Do you know what it would take to achieve herd immunity?
No, I mean, I think the range is probably reasonably speaking, since would be 70 to 90 something, just because it varies virus to virus in the way that the degree of contagiousness that it has, that number you sometimes see reproductive number, one person infecting 6, one person infecting 2, those kinds of things. And so herd immunity varies by the virus, and it's one of the points I was trying to make earlier. We don't know enough about this one to answer the question. So people throwing out numbers at this point are, guesses, estimates. They're not based on science or experience. We just don't know enough. And to me, it's one of these situations where if you don't know enough, I mean, my analogy to it was, if I had a loaded gun and the room was dark, would I pull the trigger? No. I mean, you don't make decisions that are life and death with a degree of darkness around you where you don't know what's going to happen. You need to make big life and death decisions with some light and understanding. So this herd immunity proposal by the, libertarian think tank was massively premature, to be able to throw that out there before they knew the answer to your question.
There's kind of something in this statistics that's missing. There are a lot of people who get COVID, don't die, but have lifelong results of it. And so there are a lot of people in between.
More than just death.
More than just different than death.
Yeah, the morbidity from it is also not well defined yet, in terms of the long haulers, as you're describing, and how many people end up in that category. And then, and you'll hear the political discussions around the ACA and pre-existing conditions being thrown out there to scare us all. And it applies to what you just brought up, that some members of our population, having been infected with COVID, will have ongoing health concerns that may or may not be covered by health insurance if it's a pre-existing condition. That's being used now to sort of ring the political bell and get us concerned. And I think it's reasonable to be concerned about that. Just like Pam's questions, I don't know the burden of that. You see anecdotes. I think in the New York Times or Washington Post this morning, there was a 12-year-old girl whose story about being a long hauler was her anecdote about that. I don't know what the big numbers are around that. How much of a burden is it in COVID infected countries? How many people as a percentage of the infected end up with chronic problems? That question I don't know the answer to. The answer is not 0, to your point, but I don't know what it is. Let's see. Well, it's 10:33, and I don't know if you picked up on it or not, but I feel pretty strongly about some of these issues. So if I was a little too impassioned, I don't know. I just am. That's just. I guess that's what you got this morning. But next week, I would like to hear people's thoughts about what may have been missing from the first 3 that you think we should include in a discussion about health equity. What are some suggested topics or questions that I might want to prepare a lesson around for next week. And if you take time to think about it and want to just send me emails, feel free to do it. Or right now, if anyone has some discussions or suggestions rather, please feel free to throw them out.
Well, Steve, I was curious, in that CDC study about the excess deaths in the, Latinx and the Black and the Asians. First of all, the Asians were above everybody except the Latino, except the Hispanics. So I was surprised about that. But did that study go into any discussion of the types of jobs that people had? Obviously influence whether or not you're going to get the disease. If you're a hospital worker, or if you can't stay home and work from home, you're more likely to get the disease. Did that study go into any of that?
It didn't because I think it's only a couple of days old. I think it's just getting the facts out there first, and then I think there's going to be probably some follow-up explanation and exploration of, okay, well, what do these facts mean in regards to answering some of the questions that you just brought up. But I don't know that it's been tackled yet because the numbers are so fresh out of the oven kind of thing.
Okay.
Steve, I got a question.
Yes, sir.
I would like to talk about inequities of care after the disease is discovered in individual cases. This is not a political statement, but it's an observation. When the President of the United States has been identified as testing positively, they throw the book at it medicinally. Maybe some things that they didn't need to do, shouldn't do. But you hear all this kind of extraordinary treatment. Now, what if Joe Blow, who lives on the west side of Davidson, goes to the hospital? What kind of treatment, and let's say that he is essentially of the same age and has the same health liabilities as the president or some other public figure, what kind of treatment can he expect?
Yeah.
That's for next week. You can save that.
Okay. And I think that has some interesting ramifications to it because there's a syndrome like a VIP syndrome where someone can, on the basis of their power or wealth, demand everything. And sometimes getting everything is not medically indicated, but they're powerful enough to demand it. And there can be some adverse outcomes on the basis of having the medical decisions be generated by a pressure from a powerful person or a powerful group. And so, ironically enough, you might hurt yourself by jumping in there and forcing the doctors to give me everything you got. Didn't happen in this one individual case that brought up the question, but it is interesting to think about just where there's, I think on the lower socioeconomic side of things, clearly people are not going to have access to even getting in the hospital when they need to, much less getting, the latest, greatest antibody treatment and all the specialists in the world thrown at their problem. But somewhere in between there is those of us who are privileged, insured, live in certain communities with access to healthcare that others don't have are going to be in the sweet spot to have a lower case fatality rate than others. So I can look. Yeah, thanks, John. I'll look into that a little bit more. Any other thoughts or suggestions? Okay, Charlie, I see your chat. Well, let's see if I can do an impassioned prayer. Closes. What about that? Okay. Father God, we thank you for the time that we have to come together. We thank you for the relationships that we have for each other. We thank you for the care and concern that we have for each other and for others, and brings us together today to talk about this. We ask that you have that concern and compassion grow, that you show us how to be empathetic, caring members of our communities, and that we make a difference in the world when we leave this class today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you, guys.
Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Steve.
Okay.
Steve,
Thank you.
Steve, it's Jane. I
Hey,
got
Jane.
the same 3 pages stapled, ugly, disturbing in my mailbox as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I took mine to the police department.
Oh, I took mine to the trash cans, but
Well, I just
need to
thought
join
it was
that
right
club.
to know that somebody was riding around town, Davidson, doing that. It's awful.
I think I gotta go look.
I know, I want to join that club.
Yeah.
no, it was disturbing and sad. And I don't know. It did make me uneasy, you know. But I partly I think that to the point that was made by the author that came to speak at Davidson, and he
Ken.
said, and you'll know who I'm talking about when I say what he said, but he said that we need to get proximate and we need to be uncomfortable. So, you know, some of being uncomfortable means that somebody else kind of knows what you think about something, and I'd like to be disagreed with in non-hateful ways, but I don't know. I've gotten to the point where I think I want people to know where I stand. Yeah. So I think this discomfort comes with it. So.
Well, I have a Biden sign in my yard, so I assumed also that was what prompted him to leave it in my mailbox.
Yeah, pretty sure.
And it was also looked like literature that was used during Hillary's campaign, if you notice that, and had misspelled words and
yeah, I noticed it.
Yeah,
it's I mean, it's just a real challenge these days to I had experience at a polling place recently where a candidate was wearing a face shield, and that's all. And in the line where people were coming up to vote and shaking their hands and hugging some of them and talking to them in the line wearing just a face shield. So I went up to that candidate and I said, did you get some medical advice about the face shield that you're wearing? And I guess he knew he was in for a little bit of a, so the look on his face was, you know, kind of, oh gosh. And then he says, what do you want? I did talk to my medical doctor who said it would be all right. And I said, all right for you or for the voters that are in this line that you're talking to? And then he said, why don't you just leave? That's just your opinion. And I said, it's not opinion, it's science, actually. I mean, the face shield is not adequate, doesn't adequately protect others. And it's this kind of stuff that's starting to drive me a little bit nuts, is that it's this kind of person who would make this kind of decision about protecting people in a line of voters is the same person who wants to go to Raleigh and vote on how to protect us as a state. To me, that's just, I mean, that very decision on his part to do something that science would say is not protecting his voters. You know, this is political as it gets, but to me, it's a disqualification. It just is something that indicates a lack of judgment that this is a person who's putting the politics filter up there. What's ironic about it is what I'm doing right now is political. And so if I go up to him and say, I don't think that face mask is the right thing that you wear, then me doing that is a political act and can be dismissed on the basis of, you know, the sign I have in my yard, when it doesn't change the fact that a face shield is an inadequate way to protect people around you when you're talking to them. It doesn't do the job. The fact is still the fact, but just me going up to do it and tell him that is dismissed as something I'm doing for political reasons, which really frustrating because people like Fauci are being discredited. The man's not a Democrat. I mean, he's a scientist. A face mask blocks more vapor coming out of your mouth than a face shield does. I mean, these are just facts. I'm going nuts.
I've been pleased and pleasantly surprised. I've been working early voting at Cornelius Town Hall, and not one of us there, at least that I've talked to, has seen anybody come to vote that didn't have a mask on, which I thought was very good.
Right.
I checked them in, and it's hard to understand their names when they have a face mask on, but it's still it's encouraging sign, I think.
Yeah, I would say it's not 100%. I've worked there as a poll observer, and I'm keenly.
I saw you there. That
kind
would
of
be
stuff.
yeah.
So I'm it's not quite 100%, but it's high 90s of people wearing masks for sure, which is good. I mean, at least the people are doing the right thing. So that is encouraging. And it's one of those things along with social distancing that's going to bring that curve back, or, that graph back down towards baseline and help with this surge. It's just an ongoing diligent use of social distancing and masking. It's already worked a couple of times on prior surges. It'll still work. And we should continue to do those kind of disciplined things. So, and hopefully, Fauci was talking about taking 5 states and trying to get a mask mandate. The fact that masks have become politicized is just unfathomable, amazing to me. But hopefully we'll get it figured out here. Got my fingers crossed.
Thank you, Steve.
guys.
Are you coming home from from Georgetown this week? You gonna be on your porch?
Today, I'll be home today.
I'm gonna catch you on your porch. I have something I want to talk to you about too.
All righty. And guys, feel free to send me an email. It's stevejustus@gmail.com, and I'll put it here in the chat real quick. And it's just in terms of next week.
Thank you.
All righty. See you guys. Bye.
Bye.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Steve.